Walk so silently that the bottoms of your feet become ears. This is not the usual instruction I'd give to a correspondent when commissioning them for the BBC's Newsnight, where I work as deputy editor. In fact, if I was to talk like that in the office, people might think I'd gone mad. But this quote from the American composer Pauline Oliveros is one of the things that has recently made me think about journalism in a different way. I'm going to take you through my journey into her world of deep listening, where it led me, and why I think it should inspire us day to day. This was the moment I first came across Oliveros' work, June 2019, and I was at a conference in Berlin called Engagement Explained Live. Everyone there was part of what's become known as the engaged journalism movement, interested in working out how to allow the public to participate much more deeply in the journalistic process. I'd come along, among other reasons, because I was frustrated with the typical portrayal of the public in news pieces, 5-second vox pops, weighed out for balance, and cobbled together after a few hours spent in a town on a fast train from London. Surely there had to be a better way of understanding opinions and experiences from the ground up. Maybe the answer was here. I ended up in a workshop entitled Deep Listening. It sounded interesting, if slightly pretentious. But the journalist running it, a man called Cole Goines, was terrific. He was inspired, he told us, by Pauline Oliveros, the experimental composer who coined the phrase deep listening in the 1980s. She was a radical and a pioneer in the development of electronic music. But above all, she was obsessed with what it means to use your ears properly. Listening, she argued, is the basis of all culture. And the best deep listeners of all? Babies. Here's a quote. Think of the tremendous acts of attention and concentration that babies make to explore sounds and speak their first words, to learn language and to communicate through listening. Oliveros believed that adults needed to train themselves to listen like that. She thought deep listening would open us up to interact better with others. And crucially, she saw it as a starting point for doing something. As she put it, listening is directing attention to what is heard, gathering meaning, interpreting, and deciding on action. Cole, the journalist leading the workshop, drew on her work to make a convincing argument that deep listening was of serious value for journalists too. A better culture of listening could, for example, help break down barriers between journalists and people who don't trust us. It could help us understand marginalised parts of the population and those who feel alienated or bored by news coverage. Like a lot of people, I first got interested in what we could do to understand our own country better in the wake of the EU referendum result in the summer of 2016. Journalists throughout the world made similar observations after the election of Trump in the US, the rise of populist parties in Europe, and the election of Bolsonaro in Brazil, as my colleague Consuelo discussed earlier. That we as journalists were surprised by many of these events made it crystal clear that we had put too much trust in the tools and the stories of the political class, rather than trying ourselves to listen deeply to what was really going on. The UK remains a country of profound geographical, political, and economic divisions, as the general election reminded us. And we know that many people, particularly outside of London and among minority ethnic groups, feel disconnected from the world portrayed by mainstream news media. These audiences told Ofcom in a recent report that they want to see a deeper understanding of their communities from the BBC by people with more knowledge of them. Without a doubt, we need much more diversity of all kinds within newsrooms themselves. But would deeper listening also help? I wanted to find out who was trying to listen more deeply to the public, especially to those who feel unheard by journalists, and whether it was leading to any action, as Pauline Oliveros put it. So this autumn, in my time at the Reuters Institute, I did some research. I came to realise that around the world, there are lots of journalists working to expand the demographics people media is listening to, as one academic, Andrea Wenzel, has put it. In the US, brilliant projects like City Bureau in Chicago, and in the UK, operations built around better listening, from the Bristol Cable and the Bureau Local to Tortoise Media. There are many others I could mention, but the example I want to talk through now comes from another public service broadcaster. And the reason I think it's so relevant is that in the aftermath of a British general election that has put the relationship between politicians and broadcasters under very public strain, it opens up a different way of covering politics, a way that really does let the public set the agenda. Swedish Radio is Sweden's public service radio network. And in the wake of Trump, Brexit, and some shifts in Sweden's own politics, they wanted to understand how lived experiences across the whole country were shaping events. They came up with an idea that turned the conventional news-gathering approach on its head and called it the 10 million, because Sweden had just hit 10 million inhabitants. Snow was falling outside their Stockholm offices when they invited me there in early December. Inside, the project's leader, Helena, told me that the starting point for the project in 2017 was to get out there and listen to people, especially in blank spots where we don't normally go. Working with their network of 25 local stations, they commissioned presenters and reporters to find people who they wouldn't usually talk to and to ask them the following simple questions. What are you concerned about? What are the big issues in your lives? It's not as easy as it sounds. It's one of the hardest things to do as a journalist, Helena told me. Normally you have an angle, you've decided what to talk about, and then you get reactions, wanting people to say things that fit into our stories, which can make stories boring and predictable, she said. The next bit is really important. They weren't interested in opinions. This was defiantly not a series of vox pops. They were interested in stories. Swedish Radio recorded more than 500 individual stories, from pensioners who couldn't afford to travel to see their children, to dinner ladies worried about food waste in schools. All were told in their own words. But Swedish Radio didn't just run these stories as individual vignettes. Instead, they used them as starting points for investigation and analysis. The project really took off when an election was called in 2018, because Swedish Radio built an agenda around these people. They used their stories to frame debates and to shape interviews with politicians, stories gathered locally but aired nationally. This is Inga Karin, one of those whose story they reported. She told them that her pension was so low that she couldn't afford to visit her children. Was her experience typical? What policy issues did it raise? And who, if anyone, should be held accountable? Inga Karin's story ended up on the front of all the papers, forcing the Prime Minister to phone her directly. The Swedish project was a real success, and it won a major award. So what was it that really struck a chord? Daniel Varela, one of the reporters involved, said something to me that really stuck. People now think that media and politics are the same, that we're the elite, that we don't represent what people think. This was a very smart project because it worked against this idea. It said, we'll listen to you. I couldn't look into all this without getting out there myself. So earlier this month, I went with Sally Chesworth, a Newsnight colleague based in the Northwest, to meet some people in Salford, in Rochdale, and in Mixenden, on the outskirts of Halifax in West Yorkshire. That's Mixenden Library behind me. Inside, James, the librarian, gathered together a small group of local people, from school age to pensioner. I asked some basic open questions and listened as they told us about the challenges of life with no home internet, about how hard it is to navigate the machinery of the state when you don't have a smartphone, or the money to pay for a phone call at all sometimes, and the state assumes that you do, and about the frustration of having perceptions of your community shaped too often by negative, inaccurate portrayals by journalists and others. As I sat in the library with this group of people, Something from the deep listening workshop I attended in Berlin drifted into my mind. And it was the following sentence. If journalists truly listen to the communities we serve, we could break away from narratives that are repeated over and over again and get into nuance. When I was sitting in Mixenden Library, I felt I was finally starting to get somewhere. I was hearing stories that we hadn't done before. But the hard bit is yet to come. In 3 weeks' time, I'll return to the BBC's broadcasting house just up the road from here. I'll take the lift up to my desk in the Newsnight office, and I'll have to try and put into practice some of what I've been thinking about on the programme that I love. What will travel with me from Mixenden, Stockholm, and the other research I've done this autumn? Many things, but the most important one is this. We need to open ourselves up to a broader, ground-up set of stories and perspectives from across the whole country by listening more deeply and directing attention to what is heard.